Hey everyone! I'm a storyteller that I hope my stories can help and inspire each one of you. The gentle rays of an early October sun filtered through the faded cream curtains of 247 Maple Street, casting long shadows across Robert Thompson's living room. The old grandfather clock, a wedding gift from 38 years ago, steadily marked time with its familiar tick-tock, a sound that had become both a comfort and a reminder of his solitude. At 74 years and 364 days, Robert maintained the same morning routine he'd followed for decades. His silver hair was neatly combed, his light blue button-down shirt freshly pressed, despite having no plans for the day. Old habits from 35 years of teaching high school physics died hard. He moved with deliberate steps toward his ancient coffee maker, the same one his late wife Martha had insisted on keeping because it makes coffee that tastes like coffee should. The aroma of fresh French roast filled the kitchen, momentarily masking the subtle staleness that seemed to permeate the house these days. The living room walls told the story of a life well lived, though time had faded many of the photographs to a soft sepia. There was Sarah's college graduation, Michael's first science fair victory, and Jennifer's law school ceremony. Each image captured a moment when the house had been full of laughter and purpose. Now they served as silent witnesses to the quietness that had settled in since the kids had moved on to build their own lives in different corners of the country. Robert's weathered hands wrapped around his favorite coffee mug, a chipped ceramic piece decorated with childish handprints and a messy "World's Best Dad" painted in kindergarten colors. The morning sun caught the silver frame of the largest family photo on the wall, their last Christmas together before Martha passed. The sight of it still made his throat tighten, even after all these years. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Chun from next door walking her Yorkshire Terrier, the same route she'd taken every morning for the past decade. She waved, and Robert returned the gesture with a small smile, grateful for these small daily connections that punctuated his routine. The distant sound of a lawn mower starting up and children's laughter drifting from somewhere down the street painted a portrait of suburban Sunday life, continuing as it always had. But inside 247 Maple Street, the silence seemed to grow a little heavier with each tick of the grandfather clock. Robert settled into his familiar armchair, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The morning paper lay unopened on the side table, but his eyes were drawn instead to the small calendar hanging by the phone. Tomorrow's date was circled in red, October 15th, his 75th birthday. He'd received the usual texts from his children over the past week. "Sorry, Dad, big investment merger that day. Rain check. The product launch can't be rescheduled. Atsoris, olurdua. This case is going to trial. Maybe we can celebrate next month." The excuses were different, but the message was the same. The house would be quiet tomorrow, just like any other day. Robert took another sip of his coffee, letting the warm liquid chase away the slight tremor in his hands. He was used to it by now, he told himself. That's just how life goes when your children grow up and move away. The morning light continued to strengthen, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, as Robert Thompson sat in his chair, surrounded by memories frozen in frames, preparing himself for another birthday alone. As the morning light grew stronger, Robert's gaze lingered on the collection of photographs that chronicled his family's journey. Each frame held not just an image, but a moment frozen in time, a memory that seemed to pulse with life despite the layer of dust that had settled on the glass. His eyes settled on a particular photograph, slightly askew on the wall. Martha in her favorite yellow sundress, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas she'd planted herself. Her smile, radiant and full of life, betrayed no hint of the illness that would take her just 3 months after the picture was taken. The memory of that day washed over him like a warm tide. "Robert, stop fussing with that camera and come sit with us." Martha had called, her laugh carrying across their backyard. Sarah, then 16, was helping her mother arrange a picnic blanket while 12-year-old Michael chased 10-year-old Jennifer around the garden with a water pistol. "Someone has to preserve these moments," he'd replied, adjusting the focus one last time before setting the timer and rushing to join his family. The sharp trill of his smartphone, a Christmas gift from Michael that he was still learning to navigate, pulled Robert back to the present. The screen displayed a missed FaceTime call from Jennifer. These weekly video calls had become their new normal, a poor substitute for the chaos and warmth that once filled this house. He glanced at the empty chairs around the dining table, remembering how it used to be. Martha at one end, helping Michael with his science homework while simultaneously mediating an argument between the girls about borrowed clothes. The air would be thick with the aroma of her legendary pot roast, the sound of simultaneous conversations competing with the clink of dishes and burst of laughter. Now, the table stood as a silent monument to those days, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun through windows that hadn't needed cleaning as often since the children's fingerprints stopped appearing on them. Robert pushed himself up from his chair, his joints protesting slightly, and walked to the kitchen. The refrigerator door was a time capsule of its own. Sarah's first attempt at poetry, a B-plus piece about their family cat, Michael's science fair ribbon, and Jennifer's law school acceptance letter. Newer additions were rare now, save for the occasional Christmas card or wedding invitation from former students who remembered their old physics teacher. The contrast between then and now struck him most profoundly in the everyday moments. The grocery list that once filled an entire page now barely covered a sticky note. The mountain of laundry had shrunk to manageable hills. The board games that once cluttered the living room had been neatly packed away, replaced by the crossword puzzles and books that kept him company in the quiet evenings. He remembered the challenges of being a single father, the late nights helping with homework, the rushed mornings getting everyone to school on time, the careful juggling of 3 different sports schedules. Those days had been exhausting, but they had also been full of purpose and life. "Dad, you don't have to come to every single game," Sarah had said once during her senior year. "I know I don't have to," he'd replied, adjusting his tie after a long day of teaching. "I want to." The memory brought a small smile to his face. He'd made it to every game, every recital, every science fair. Even after Martha's passing, he'd somehow managed to be there for all the important moments. Perhaps that's why the current silence felt so pronounced. He had spent so many years surrounded by the beautiful chaos of raising 3 children that the order and quiet of his current life seemed almost unnatural. His regular Sunday routine now consisted largely of solitary activities, reading the paper, tending to Martha's garden, though he could never quite get the hydrangeas to bloom as brilliantly as she had, and watching the History Channel documentaries that Michael had recommended during their last phone call. The weekly video calls with each child followed a similar pattern. Sarah, impeccably dressed even on weekends, usually called from her Manhattan apartment, the city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd talk about her latest investment deals while multitasking on her laptop. Michael would call from his Tesla, caught in Seattle's perpetual traffic, enthusiastically explaining his latest tech project in terms Robert pretended to understand. Jennifer's calls came late in the evening, her Chicago law office's lights burning bright behind her as she apologized for working another weekend. They were all living their dreams, dreams that he and Martha had encouraged them to pursue. He was proud of them, truly. But sometimes, in moments like these, surrounded by the echoes of a fuller life, he couldn't help but wish. The grandfather clock chimed, interrupting his thoughts. Another hour had passed in the quiet house at 247 Maple Street, where the gap between memory and reality grew a little wider with each tick of the second hand. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Robert's phone buzzed again. Sarah's name flashed across the screen, accompanied by a photo of her in her graduation cap and gown. His heart lifted momentarily. Perhaps she had found a way to make it tomorrow after all. "Hi, sweetheart," he answered, keeping his voice light and cheerful. "Dad!" Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker, the familiar sounds of New York traffic providing a constant backdrop. "I'm just running between meetings, but I wanted to catch you before tomorrow. I feel terrible about not being there." Robert sank deeper into his armchair, his free hand absently smoothing a wrinkle in his pants. "Don't worry about it, honey. It's just another day." "It's not just another day, Dad. It's your 75th. There was a pause, filled with the sound of papers shuffling. "This merger is just, the timing couldn't be worse. The Japanese investors are only in town tomorrow, and if we don't close this deal..." "Sarah," he interrupted gently, "I understand. Really, I'll make it up to you. Once this deal closes, I'll fly down for a whole weekend. We can do something special." "That would be nice," he replied, though they both knew her weekends had a way of filling up with urgent business matters. "How are you doing? Are you eating properly?" A small laugh. "Dad, I'm 42, not 12. You'll always be my little girl who refused to eat anything green. I eat kale now, believe it or not." "Listen, Dad, I've got to run. My next meeting's about to start. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Love you. Love you too, sweetie." The call ended before he could say more. Robert sat there for a moment, the phone still warm in his hand, when it buzzed again. This time it was Michael's text. "Hey Dad, totally swamped with product launch. Working round the clock. Can we rain check birthday? We'll call TMRW. Sorry. Robert typed back, "Of course, son. Good luck with the launch." He had barely set the phone down when it lit up once more. Jennifer calling. "Dad!" Her voice was strained, exhausted. "Please tell me Sarah or Mike are going to be there tomorrow." "They're both busy," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's fine, Jenny. These things happen." "I hate this," she sighed. "I've got this massive case going to trial, and the partner's breathing down my neck. I've been sleeping in the office, Dad. I barely have time to shower, let alone fly home." "Jennifer Rachel Thompson," he said, using the tone that had gotten her through law school. "You focus on your case. Your old dad will be just fine. But, no buts. You've worked too hard to get where you are. I'm proud of you, sweetheart." There was a moment of silence on the line. "I miss you, Dad." "Miss you too, honey." After they hung up, Robert stood and walked to the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly as he opened it, revealing a small chocolate cake he'd bought from the local grocery store. The kind Martha used to make from scratch was better, but this would do. He closed the door without taking it out. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old lesson plans, lay 3 sealed envelopes. Inside each was a birthday card he'd picked out for his children weeks ago. He'd planned to give them out tomorrow, each one containing a carefully written note about how proud he and Martha would have been of the adults they'd become. Robert rubbed his eyes, suddenly tired. The cards would keep for another time. The wall clock ticked steadily as evening approached. He began his usual dinner preparations, a routine designed for one. As he reached for a plate, his hand brushed against the stack of plates Martha had insisted on keeping for when the whole family visits. They hadn't been used in over a year. The microwave hummed, heating up a single portion of leftover casserole. Robert glanced at the dining room table, large enough to seat 8 comfortably, and opted instead for his spot at the kitchen counter. No point in rattling around that big table by himself. As he ate, he couldn't help but remember past birthdays. Sarah's handmade cards, covered in glitter that would shed for weeks afterward. Michael's elaborate science-themed presents, including one memorable year when he'd tried to create a birthday explosion that had left scorch marks on the ceiling. Jennifer's tradition of waking him up at midnight to be the first to wish him happy birthday. Martha's special breakfast spread, always featuring his favorite blueberry pancakes. The memories were sweet, but they left a bitter aftertaste now. His phone buzzed one final time, a group text from his children. "Sarah, love you, Dad. Red heart. Michael, happy early birthday. Birthday cake. Jennifer, we'll celebrate soon. Promise. Balloon." Robert typed back, "Thank you, kids. Love you all." He set his phone face down and finished his dinner in silence, as the sun set on the eve of his 75th birthday. The next morning dawned unusually warm for October. Mary Anderson stood in her kitchen, wrapping a still warm loaf of banana bread in checkered cloth. Through her window, she could see Robert's house next door, quiet as always, a single light glowing in the kitchen. For 15 years, she'd lived next door to the Thompsons. She'd watched the children grow up, shared Martha's grief during her illness, and witnessed the gradual emptying of the once bustling household. Today, something about the solitude next door felt heavier than usual. "George," she called to her husband, who was absorbed in his morning paper. "When was the last time you saw any of Robert's kids visit? Christmas, maybe?" George lowered his paper. "No, that was the Christmas before last. They all had other plans last year." Mary's brow furrowed as she tucked the final corner of the cloth around the bread. She'd been meaning to bring this over since yesterday. Robert had helped water her plants while they were on vacation last month, and she believed in returning kindnesses. The morning air was crisp as she crossed the short distance between their houses. Wind chimes tinkled softly from Robert's porch, the ones Martha had hung years ago. Mary remembered how Robert would fix them every spring, saying Martha had loved their sound. She knocked gently on the door. After a moment, Robert appeared, already dressed in his usual button-down shirt and pressed slacks. "Mary," he smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "What brings you by?" "Just thought you might like some fresh banana bread." She held out the wrapped loaf. "George can't have too many sweets these days, and I know it was always your favorite." "You're too kind," Robert accepted the bread, the familiar scent triggering memories of countless neighborhood gatherings. "Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee?" Mary stepped into the familiar hallway, noting how the house seemed suspended in time, preserved like a museum to happier days. As Robert led her to the kitchen, her eyes caught sight of the calendar hanging by the phone. The red circle around today's date made her pause. "Robert Thompson," she said, her voice taking on the tone she'd used during her 30 years as an elementary school teacher. "Is today your birthday?" Robert's slight hesitation before answering told her everything. "Yes, 75 today," he said lightly, busying himself with the coffee maker. Mary's eyes scanned the quiet house, the single plate by the sink, the small store-bought cake visible through the refrigerator's glass door. "Are the kids coming by to celebrate?" "They're all quite busy," Robert replied, his back turned as he measured coffee grounds. "Sarah has an important merger, Michael's launching a new product, and Jennifer has a big trial. We'll celebrate another time." The forced casualness in his voice made Mary's heart ache. She'd known Robert and Martha since their children were small, had brought casseroles during Martha's illness, had watched Robert raise 3 children alone while never missing a day of teaching. The thought of him spending his 75th birthday alone was simply unacceptable. "Well," she said, accepting the coffee cup he offered, "that won't do at all." Robert looked up, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "Mary, really, it's fine." "Robert Thompson, I've known you too long for that." She set her cup down with determination. "Your children may be busy, but you have more family than you realize." She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with surprising speed for someone who often complained about modern technology. The local community Facebook group, Hearts of Maple Street, had over 500 members, most of whom had either been Robert's students or had children who were. As Robert sipped his coffee unaware, Mary typed out a message. "Urgent. Our beloved neighbor and retired physics teacher Robert Thompson is spending his 75th birthday alone today. His children can't make it. For 35 years, he taught our kids, supported our community, and asked for nothing in return. It's time we showed him what family really means. Meet me at my house in 1 hour to plan something special. Please share." Within minutes, reactions and comments began flooding in. "Mr. Thompson, the teacher who stayed late every day to help with math. He helped my Tommy get into engineering school. Remember when he organized the fundraiser for Mrs. Martinez's cancer treatment? Count me in." Sharing this with the whole neighborhood group, Mary smiled as her phone buzzed continuously with notifications. She looked up at Robert, who was telling her about his latest attempt to grow Martha's beloved hydrangeas. "Robert," she interrupted gently, "would you mind helping me with something this afternoon? I have some boxes in my attic that need sorting." "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "What time would you like me to come over?" "Around 4. Mary stood, her mind already racing with plans. "Ain't you hobirchi? Wear something nice." As she walked back home, her phone was already ringing. Kelly Martinez, now a reporter for the local news station and one of Robert's former students, was on the line. "Mrs. Anderson, I just saw your post. I think we can make this story even bigger." By noon, Mary Anderson's living room had transformed into an impromptu command center. The Facebook post had gone viral within their community, and the response was overwhelming. Every few minutes, the doorbell would ring, bringing another neighbor eager to help. "The bakery I work at can donate a proper birthday cake," announced Lisa Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter who had once struggled with physics until Robert spent countless lunch breaks tutoring her. Now she owned the most successful bakery in town. "And not just any cake. I'm thinking a custom design with scientific elements. Dad always loved drawing atomic structures on the board." Tom Martinez, Kelly's husband and the owner of the local hardware store, was already coordinating with a team to set up lighting and a small stage in the community park behind Robert's house. "Remember the physics demonstrations he used to do at the school fair? My kids still talk about the rocket launches." The park had become the obvious choice for the celebration. Not only was it easily accessible, but it held special meaning. Robert had helped design the space 15 years ago, insisting on including educational panels about basic physics principles alongside the playground equipment. "I've got about 30 of his former students confirmed already," said Kelly, looking up from her laptop. "Some are driving in from 3 hours away. Mike Peters, you remember him? The one who's now a NASA engineer? He's actually flying in from Houston." Mary watched as her living room filled with more people, each bringing ideas and resources. The energy was infectious, years of gratitude and respect for Robert Thompson finally finding their moment of expression. Sarah Williams, who ran the local diner, was organizing the food. "He comes in every Sunday after church, always orders the same thing, chicken pot pie and black coffee. Never complains, even when we're slammed. Always has a kind word for the new waitresses. I'm bringing his favorite, plus enough to feed an army." The afternoon sun filtered through Mary's windows as different groups formed to handle various aspects of the celebration. In one corner, Robert's former teaching colleagues huddled around a tablet, creating a video montage of old school photos and messages from students who couldn't attend. "Look at this," called out James Parker, holding up his phone. He was reading messages from the expanding social media response. "Mr. Thompson wrote my college recommendation letter. Now I'm a professor myself. He visited me in the hospital when I had my accident in 11th grade. Brought my homework so I wouldn't fall behind. After my dad left, he made sure I had rides to all my science competitions. Never made me feel different from the other kids." The doorbell rang again. This time it was Eleanor Hughes, Robert's former principal, now retired herself. "I saw the post," she said, slightly out of breath. "Robert Thompson was the finest teacher I ever had the privilege of working with. Did you know he never took a sick day in 35 years? Even came in the day after Martha's funeral, said his students needed consistency." Mary checked her watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. Soon, Robert would be coming over, expecting to help with non-existent boxes. She raised her voice over the bustling crowd. "All right, everyone. Robert will be here any minute. We need to move this operation to the park. Remember, absolute silence when he walks through." The room quickly emptied, people moving with purposeful efficiency. Tom's team had already strung lights between the trees. Lisa's assistants were carefully transporting the elaborate cake, a masterpiece featuring educational symbols and a subtle atomic structure design. The local jazz band, led by another former student, was setting up their equipment. Kelly pulled Mary aside before leaving. "The story's going out on the evening news. We're keeping it local for now, but with the way it's spreading on social media, this might be bigger than we planned." Mary nodded, watching through her window as the park transformed. Chairs appeared, tables were set up, and banner was carefully hung between 2 oak trees. "Happy 75th birthday to Mr. Thompson, teacher, mentor, friend." Her phone buzzed, a text from George, who was keeping watch next door. Robert just went inside to change. "Operation Birthday is go." Mary took a deep breath, straightening her dress. In a few minutes, she would walk over and bring Robert to what he thought would be an afternoon of attic organization. Instead, he would find hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, gathered to show him that family isn't always about blood. Through her window, she could see the last streaks of afternoon sun catching the banner, making it glow. It reminded her of something Martha used to say, "Sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest legacies." As she headed for her front door, Mary smiled. Robert Thompson was about to discover just how loud his legacy had become. At precisely 4 o'clock, Robert stood on his front porch, straightening his collar. Despite his insistence that it was just another day, he'd chosen to wear the blue tie Martha had given him on their last anniversary together. Some habits of presentability never quite left the old teacher. The walk to Mary's house took exactly 37 steps. He'd counted them countless times over the years. Today, each step felt heavier than usual, his mind still lingering on the morning's quiet birthday rituals. No cards in the mailbox, no early morning calls, just the gentle tick of the grandfather clock marking time's passage. Mary was waiting on her porch, an unusually bright smile on her face. "Robert, right on time as always." "Military precision," he joked weakly, following her lead. But instead of heading toward her house, Mary gestured toward the park path. "Actually, I just remembered. I left the attic key in the community center. Would you mind walking with me to get it?" Robert's brow furrowed slightly. Something about Mary's tone seemed off, but he nodded amiably. "Of course." They walked in companionable silence along the familiar path, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. As they rounded the final bend, Robert was lost in thought, remembering the many times he'd walked this same path with his children, with Martha, with his students. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. "Surprise!" The word exploded from hundreds of throats at once, nearly knocking him backward with its force. Robert blinked, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The park had been transformed. Strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, glowing softly in the late afternoon sun. A stage had been set up beneath the old oak trees, adorned with banners and balloons. Tables stretched as far as he could see, laden with food and surrounded by people. So many people. But it was the faces that struck him hardest. Faces he knew. Faces he'd taught. Faces that had aged but still carried the echo of the teenagers they'd once been. Emere Thompson. A tall man in a NASA jacket stepped forward. Mike Peters, class of '92. Remember that failed rocket experiment that nearly set the lab on fire? The one that inspired you to become an aerospace engineer? Robert found his voice, though it quavered slightly. How could I forget? More faces emerged from the crowd. Lisa Chun, bearing an elaborate cake decorated with perfect atomic structures. Tom Martinez, grinning beside the lighting setup he'd arranged. Sarah Williams from the diner, standing proudly next to tables full of his favorite dishes. Dad! Robert's heart stopped. There, pushing through the crowd, was Sarah, his Sarah, still in her business suit, looking slightly disheveled from what must have been a rushed flight. But, your merger. He stammered. Some things are more important, she said, pulling him into a fierce hug. Kelly's news story went viral. When we saw what the community was planning, her voice broke slightly. We couldn't miss it, came Michael's voice as he appeared on Robert's other side, followed closely by Jennifer. All three of you. Robert's voice failed him entirely. The crowd parted as Kelly Martinez stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. Mr. Thompson, she began, her professional broadcaster's voice carrying clearly across the park. For 35 years, you taught physics to the students of this town. But more than that, you taught us about life, about perseverance, about kindness. The crowd murmured in agreement as Kelly continued. We all remember how you stayed late to help struggling students, how you never gave up on anyone, how you made the most complex concepts seem simple through your famous real-world demonstrations. She gestured to a screen where images began to play. Photographs spanning decades of teaching, of community service, of quiet moments of mentorship. Robert saw himself, younger, darker-haired, demonstrating principles of motion with a tennis ball. Another shot showed him helping with the community garden project, Martha by his side. More recent photos showed him at school events, at graduation ceremonies, always in the background, always supporting. But most importantly, Kelly's voice softened, you showed us what it means to be part of a community. After Mrs. Thompson passed, you channeled your grief into helping others. You never let your own struggles prevent you from being there for your students, your neighbors, your town. Robert felt Mary's hand slip into his on one side, Sarah's on the other. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, its light catching the tears that now flowed freely down his cheeks. So today, Kelly concluded, her own voice thick with emotion, we wanted to show you that family isn't just about blood. It's about all the lives you touch, all the hearts you change, all the people you help along the way. Happy 75th birthday, Mr. Thompson. This is your legacy. The park erupted in applause as the band struck up Happy Birthday. Robert stood there, surrounded by his children, his students, his community, his family. For the first time since Martha's passing, the silence that had filled his house seemed very far away. As the last notes of Happy Birthday faded into the evening air, Robert found himself surrounded by a sea of familiar faces, each carrying a memory, each part of his story. The crowd naturally formed a circle around him as Kelly handed him the microphone. He began, then stopped, overwhelmed. A lifetime of teaching had given him countless hours of public speaking experience, but this moment left him speechless. After a deep breath, he tried again. When I woke up this morning, his voice wavered slightly, I thought I knew what loneliness was. I thought I understood what it meant to be. He glanced at his children, who watched him with tear-filled eyes. To be growing old. The setting sun cast long shadows across the park as he continued, his teacher's voice gradually returning. Martha, my wife, used to say that a teacher never really knows their impact. We plant seeds, she'd say, but we rarely get to see the forest. He gestured to the crowd, his hand trembling slightly. But today I see the forest. I see it in each of you. In Mike, who once accidentally set off the fire alarm during a chemistry experiment and now designs spacecraft. In Lisa, who struggled with velocity calculations and now runs the best bakery in town. In Kelly, who was so shy she could barely give oral presentations and now broadcasts the news. Sarah stepped forward, taking her father's hand. Dad, when we saw Kelly's news story, she paused, composing herself. I was sitting in my office in Manhattan, preparing for the biggest merger of my career, when my phone started buzzing with messages from old classmates. They were sharing stories about you, how you helped them with college applications, how you attended their parents' funerals, how you never gave up on anyone. Michael joined them, his tech executive polish cracking with emotion. I canceled my product launch, he admitted. The board wasn't happy, but when I explained, he smiled through tears. Turns out 3 of them had physics teachers who changed their lives too. Jennifer, still in her courtroom suit, completed the family circle. The judge herself told me to go when she heard why I needed a continuance. She said, good teachers are like second parents to the whole community. The crowd murmured in agreement. and Robert saw countless nods among his former students. Many were now parents themselves, their own children standing beside them, hearing stories about the legendary Mr. Thompson. Eleanor Hughes, his former principal, stepped forward. "Robert, do you remember what you said to me when I asked why you never took a sick day, even after Martha passed?" Robert nodded slowly. "I said my students needed consistency, that some of them didn't have enough of it at home. And now look," Eleanor gestured to the gathering, "at all the lives you made more consistent, more stable, more meaningful." Tom Martinez's voice carried from near the stage. "Speaking of consistency, Mr. T, remember that physics principle you always talked about? For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction." The crowd finished in unison, many laughing through tears. "Well," Mary spoke up, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet park, "your action was 35 years of quiet dedication. This," she gestured to the hundreds of people gathered, "this is just physics." Robert looked around at the faces surrounding him, his children, his students, his neighbors, his friends. Each one represented a connection, a moment, a small kindness given without expectation of return. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues, as if nature itself was celebrating the moment. "Martha would have loved this," he said softly, then louder into the microphone. "Martha would have loved this. She always said that family was about more than blood, that it was about who shows up, who stays, who remembers." His voice grew stronger. "I spent this morning looking at old photographs, remembering when this house was full of life. I never realized." He had to pause again, collecting himself. "I never realized that it still is. That family isn't confined to four walls. That it exists in every life we touch, every kindness we share, every lesson we teach." The last rays of sunlight caught the tears on his cheeks as he concluded. "I thought I was alone. But look at my family, look at all of you. A teacher never really retires, does he? And a father." He squeezed Sarah's hand, reached for Michael and Jennifer. "A father never stops learning from his children." As if on cue, the strings of lights overhead flickered to life, turning the park into a magical wonderland. The band began to play softly, and Lisa wheeled out the elaborate cake, its atomic structure decorations glowing in the gentle light. "Happy birthday, Dad," Sarah whispered, and this time, when Robert's eyes filled with tears, they were tears of joy. "请完成写作大纲中的部分吧。第八部分，故事解决." The celebration continued well into the evening, the park glowing with warmth and laughter. Small groups formed and reformed, sharing stories, memories, and the kind of connection that only comes from shared history and mutual respect. At a table near the cake, Robert sat surrounded by his children, watching the scene unfold. Sarah had loosened her tie and kicked off her heels, looking more relaxed than she had in years. Michael had put away his phone, a minor miracle in itself, and was eagerly catching up with his old classmates. Jennifer, still in her court suit, but with her hair now falling loose around her shoulders, leaned against her father's shoulder like she used to do as a little girl. "Dad," Sarah spoke up, breaking a comfortable silence, "I've been thinking, maybe I could work remotely more often. The company's been pushing for more work-life balance anyway." Robert turned to her, seeing not the powerful executive she'd become, but glimpses of the little girl who used to sit on his lap during story time. "You don't have to. I want to," she interrupted gently. "Today made me realize what I've been missing, what we've all been missing." Michael nodded, absently turning his water glass. "I've got a development team in Charlotte. Been thinking about relocating here to oversee it personally. Silicon Valley's getting too crowded anyway. And my firm's opening a branch office in Raleigh," Jennifer added. "It's only an hour away. I could handle cases from there, come home on weekends." Robert felt his heart swell, but years of parental wisdom made him pause. "Kids, I appreciate what you're saying, but I don't want you to upend your lives out of guilt. Today was wonderful, but..." "It's not guilt, Dad." Jennifer sat up, her lawyer's conviction in her voice. "It's clarity. Sometimes it takes a moment like this to show us what really matters." Across the park, Mary was organizing a group of volunteers to begin cleanup, but Tom Martinez waved them off. "Leave it for tomorrow," he called out. "Tonight's for celebrating." Lisa approached their table with fresh coffee, Robert's favorite blend from her bakery. "Mr. Thompson," she said, setting down the cups, "we're thinking of starting a mentorship program at the community center. Would you consider teaching again?" Robert's eyes lit up. "I'd love to." "See," Sarah squeezed his hand. "You never really retired. You just needed a different classroom." As if to emphasize her point, a group of his former students' children approached the table, clutching notebooks. Mr. Thompson, a young boy who looked remarkably like Mike Peters once had, asked shyly, "Mom says you give the best help with science homework." Robert laughed, the sound carrying across the park. "Pull up some chairs," he said, already reaching for a napkin to draw diagrams. "Let's see what we're working with." As he began explaining basic physics concepts to the eager young faces, his own children exchanged knowing looks. The teacher in him had never really retired. It had just been waiting for a new audience. The evening deepened, but no one seemed eager to leave. The band had switched to softer melodies, and couples swayed gently under the strings of lights. Robert watched as decades of community life played out before him. Former students who had married each other, children he had taught who now had children of their own, neighborhoods that had grown together through births, deaths, marriages, and all of life's moments in between. Mary appeared at his shoulder, looking satisfied despite her exhaustion. "Robert," she said softly, "Martha would be so proud of this moment." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed, "She always said a home isn't just a house. It's the love you fill it with." "Well," Mary gestured to the gathered crowd, "looks like your home just got a lot bigger." Sarah, who had been listening, suddenly stood up. "That reminds me, Dad, we have one more surprise." She nodded to Michael, who pulled out his phone and pulled up some images. "We've been talking and we think it's time to renovate the house." "What?" Robert blinked in surprise. "Nothing major," Jennifer assured him quickly. "Just updates to make it more comfortable for family gatherings. A bigger kitchen for Sunday dinners, a patio for summer barbecues, and a proper guest room," Michael added, "for when we come to visit. Which will be often," he emphasized. "Plus," Sarah smiled, "the community center programs could use some space for afternoon tutoring." Robert looked at the plans on Michael's phone, then at his children's eager faces, then at the community still celebrating around him. He thought of Martha, of quiet mornings and noisy family dinners, of homework sessions and science experiments, of a lifetime of teaching and learning and growing. "Yes," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes to all of it." The night air had grown cool, but no one seemed to notice. The park remained full of warmth, the warmth of connection, of community, of family both born and chosen. Robert Thompson's 75th birthday hadn't gone as he'd expected that morning. It had gone infinitely better. A week later, Robert sat at his newly crowded kitchen table, surrounded by the warm aroma of Sarah's first attempt at Martha's blueberry pancake recipe. The kitchen windows were open to the crisp autumn morning, carrying in the sound of Michael directing a contractor about the patio plans and Jennifer's voice as she discussed community center programs with Mary over the fence. "Dad," Sarah called from the stove, frowning at a slightly charred pancake, "how did Mom get these so perfectly golden every time?" Robert smiled, remembering countless Sunday mornings watching Martha's practiced flip of the spatula. She always said the secret was patience and love. He stood up, moving to his daughter's side. "Here, let me show you." As they worked together at the stove, Robert glanced around his kitchen, really looked at it, for the first time in years. The room that had felt so empty just a week ago now showed signs of renewed life. Michael's laptop open on the counter, Jennifer's case files stacked neatly by the window, Sarah's elegant briefcase leaning against a chair. Their presence filled more than just physical space. It filled the hollow places in his heart he hadn't even realized had grown so deep. The sound of children's laughter drifted in from the front yard, where a group of students had gathered for their first Saturday morning physics tutoring session. They were setting up the same rocket experiment that had once nearly set the school lab on fire, though this time under Tom Martinez's careful supervision. "You know," Sarah said, successfully flipping a perfectly golden pancake, "I was thinking about what you always taught us about physics, about how energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes form." Robert nodded, curious where she was going with this. "Maybe love is like that too," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "The love you and Mom put into this family, into your students, into this community, it didn't disappear. It just transformed, and now it's coming back in new ways." Through the window, Robert could see Mary hanging new wind chimes on his porch, similar to the ones Martha had loved, their gentle tinkling carrying on the morning breeze. The contractor was discussing plans with Michael to make the backyard more accessible for community gatherings. Jennifer had spread her papers across the porch swing, working on proposals for after-school programs while enjoying the morning sun. "Last week," Robert said slowly, "I thought turning 75 meant I was reaching an end. But really, It was a beginning, Sarah finished, sliding the last pancake onto a plate. A new chapter. The doorbell rang and Jennifer's voice called out, "I'll get it." Moments later, Lisa Chin appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying a box from her bakery. "Saturday morning delivery as promised, Mr. Thompson. Though I see you're already well supplied with breakfast. Join us," Robert smiled, pulling out another chair. "Sarah's just mastered the Thompson family pancake flip." "Actually," Lisa hesitated, then grinned, "I brought something else too. Remember how you used to use donuts to teach us about rotational motion?" From the box, she produced a carefully crafted donut, decorated with mathematical equations and icing. For today's lesson, the kids are going to love it. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver in Robert's hair and the laugh lines around his eyes, lines that had deepened considerably over the past week. The house that had once echoed with silence now hummed with life. The sizzle of pancakes, the murmur of conversation, the distant shouts of excited students, the gentle chime of Martha's bells. In the living room, the grandfather clock still marked time with its steady tick-tock, but Robert no longer heard loneliness in its rhythm. Instead, he heard the heartbeat of a home renewed, of a family expanded, of a life entering not its twilight, but its golden hour. The physics teacher in him knew that time moved in only one direction. But as he sat at his kitchen table, watching his daughter serve slightly imperfect but love-filled pancakes to a growing Saturday morning crowd, he understood that life's trajectory wasn't just about forward motion. It was about the connections made along the way, the lives touched, the love shared, a complex web of relationships and moments that defied simple linear measurement. "Dad!" Sarah's voice brought him back to the present. "What are you thinking about?" Robert looked at his daughter, at the kitchen full of life, at the yard full of promise, and smiled. "I'm thinking Martha was right. A home isn't just a house, and family isn't just blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who remembers. And who makes the pancakes?" Sarah laughed, setting a fresh stack on the table. "And who makes the pancakes?" Robert agreed, his heart full. Outside, the wind chimes tinkled in the morning breeze, their sound carrying across Maple Street. A gentle reminder that while some things change, love, like energy, never disappears. It just transforms, flowing endlessly between hearts and homes, between generations and communities, between past and present and future, in an eternal dance of connection and renewal.